Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the third session of today. No technical issues, so we are doing great. And I'm so glad the people in the chat, you guys are loving this. This makes me super happy. So welcome to our third session for today's Leader Talk, Engage Learners with AI-Powered Content, so sponsored by Adobe, CGS Immersive, CommLab India, InfoPro Learning, and Skook. So yes, I'm Liz Faith, the Events Marketing Specialist here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. So yes, before we get started, let's go over some few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. So throughout today's event, please feel free to use that chat window. We'll have some chat prompts, polls. So this will be to interact with our speaker with any comments. And as for questions, please submit all questions in the Q&A section on your tool below. We will be addressing questions and comments throughout and at the end of the program during the Q&A section. And then at the end of your time here with us, you'll notice a short evaluation survey popped open in another tab in your browser. We would appreciate hearing your thoughts on today's event. And all of our sessions are being recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you'll receive a follow-up email from us to include the link to the on-demand sessions. If this is your first Training Industry event, we would love to welcome you. We exist to make connections among learning and development professionals. We offer tons of resources to support your role in L&D, like live events like today's Leader Talk, as well as through articles on our site, our magazine, conferences, research reports, podcasts, and our membership. We would also love to hear about what you've learned from today's session on social media, so please follow us on your favorite platforms for us to continue the conversation. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. Partridge is an e-learning evangelist at Adobe Systems. He has served on the doctoral faculty of the University of Georgia and Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and taught education and the arts in the university for more than 20 years. He has spoken to groups around the world about education and e-learning. And with that, take it away, Alan.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to all of you for joining today. I'm really looking forward to today's session. It should be all kinds of fun. I'm going to find my little screen share button. There it is. There it is. It was hiding. There we go. So that I can share my screen with you to kind of get things going. I'm so excited about today's session. And, I've been writing articles and doing sessions and really wrapping my head around and hurrying to understand everything that I can about artificial intelligence and its implications for all of us. And one of the areas that I'm sort of hearing universally from people when I talk to them about their corporate strategy and about their AI experiences is that they have been sort of running into similar challenges. Lots of challenges with security, lots of challenges with legal, lots of challenges with IT on a level which is kind of unprecedented, right? So for those of us who do corporate learning, it's common for us to have experiences that include a lot of roadblocks or limitations. And a lot of the time, those things are due to our obligation to make sure that we don't put the organization in any jeopardy. But that has been escalated substantially by the addition of the kinds of things that are happening in the world of AI. And so today, I'll have a chance to talk to you a little bit about what does that look like specifically? What kind of strategy can you develop to better handle the challenges that come along with AI and to anticipate what they'll look like? How can you work with your organization to educate everyone on exactly what kinds of experiences they should expect and what kind of approaches they might want to take? So I'll share with you a little bit of new research. I'll walk you through some important key ideas. And this slide is new for me. I put the QR code on there so that you can scan that thing and it'll give you a direct link to my LinkedIn. I have been publishing most of my articles in either directly in LinkedIn or with primary links through LinkedIn in the hopes that people will be able to find them more easily. And I also encourage you to participate in the Adobe e-learning community, which is just elearning.adobe.com if you like to follow those kinds of things. So today's session, what are we actually going to dig in on? What are we going to drill on? First of all, I want to encourage you to participate actively in the chat. I do follow the chat. I will follow what your comments are. I'll pay attention to what you have to say, and I will periodically ask you direct questions, and I'll look to the chat to see what you had to say. I think that it's always the case in any session that the wealth of knowledge is from the whole of the group of people who've assembled rather than just from the speaker. So it's really important that we take advantage of these opportunities to kind of leverage those moments. We're going to go through these 4 basic questions. What are the primary ethical concerns for the use of AI? How can you ensure that the content produced will not have any legal baggage sort of gripping onto the material that you produce? How can you ensure that you aren't unwittingly exposing private or secure corporate data using your AI methods? And what's the difference between generative AI and other approaches that are AI? And that becomes important later because when we start to look at the legal implications, they're going to vary depending on what kind of an AI approach we're actually using. Along the way, again, I encourage you to make your comments in the chat, ask questions, prompt one another, especially if you have experiences that are similar to the ones that I mentioned. I encourage you to lay those out there and share with your colleagues. If you find that your experience has been quite different than something I'm discussing, love to hear that too. We're very early in the days of AI, so it's definitely a good time to share as much information with each other as we can. So 40% of jobs will be impacted by AI in the next 3 years. This, according to World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report from 2023. So this is just a prediction of up through 2023, up through 2026. And I think that we can see that it's probably closer to 99% of jobs that will be impacted over the next 5 years or the next 6 years. We're already seeing a rush of impact across virtually every field. Even fields that none of us would ever have anticipated have seen the interjection of even subtle forms of AI into areas that you wouldn't have expected it to get injected. So it is unquestionable that AI is going to find its way into virtually every kind of role in your organization, and not just the most exclusive technical roles, or not just those places that you think that were the most obvious candidates. So we dig in on that first question. What are the primary ethical concerns for the use of AI in content development? We can drill in pretty quickly to find some answers and to understand what kinds of issues might be raised. These are 4 of the more dominant concerns that I think may not have flown across your radar initially, but now are probably starting to become apparent as you start to explore this idea of creation of content or building content and using assistive technology from AI as we go. The one thing I would say about this is that I really think that as we encounter AI more and more for these kinds of roles, we should think of it as an accelerator rather than as a replacement. That most organizations that are approaching these problems now are starting to follow a model where rather than try to replace the role of a person, we try to augment the tools and capabilities of a person without causing huge levels of disruption in the underlying processes that people do. In other words, it seems to be much more popular and much more effective to take care of mundane kinds of chores that support the work that a person is already doing than it is to simply generate content in whole in the hopes that that will somehow magically replace a person. Now, I've heard this described from both angles. You know, early on, we had some conferences in the HR field where people were talking very actively about their hopes that they would be able to reduce workforces by 30%, 40%, and higher. And my initial reaction was, this is a terrible idea because people are often uh, very sensitive to the notion that they might be replaced by AI or replaced by robots. And you shouldn't underestimate the power of people to throw boots into the system, to sabotage, so to speak. So it would be really unwise. There are other reasons why it would be unwise, not the least of which is, as you'll see as I go through here, the recommendations specifically are that you ensure that you never trust AI out of the gate on its own. And this is 100% true. I don't think I've ever seen an AI answer, an AI document, an AI image, an AI anything that didn't have fundamental flaws when it came back to me. Those flaws might be something that the average person would miss, but they're often not. And those flaws might be something that nobody cares about or that doesn't make any difference, but especially because most of us deal in this as a part of learning and development. Being accurate and being 100% accurate is absolutely critical. Most AI models today are judged to be accurate to about 95%, with a hallucination rate somewhere around 5 to 3%, depending on the system and the solution and your questions and that sort of thing. But a hallucination at all inside of something that is learning content is absolutely not reasonable to maintain, right? So you can't trust the system on its own. You have to be prepared to make those observations, go through the content, and then actually evaluate it and determine its accuracy and make sure that you're getting it right in the same way that you would expect to get your learning and training materials right on their own. So when we look at these sort of individual aspects, one of the major areas is bias and representation. Now, you'll find I've got a couple of links here for you today of articles that I did that correlate to this and to some related content. The one that correlates to this, I'll give you a link for at the end of today's session. And it's specifically named the same Who's Driving the Bus. And in it, I cite specific sources and use cases that can help you understand where these ideas are coming from, where these thoughts are coming from. All of these examples are coming from actual businesses that ran into actual snags pretty early on. When we look at bias and representation, we often talk about this as it relates to talent first, because often we're talking about the people that we are screening for jobs, or we're talking about the kinds of representations that we're making. This can also be, though, things like the representations that are happening inside of the content that we're developing. Most of us have sort of gotten in the habit of saying, let's not have every single person that we show an image of all represent the same gender, the same background, the same ethnicity, and so on. Let's mix it up so as not to sort of introduce this intrinsic bias. But there are also notions of bias that exist not just in imagery, but also inside of text, right? So I know that one of the challenges people face is when they start to talk about generative AI, they start to think, oh, this is magic voodoo in the computer. It does this stuff for itself. It does not. In all of the major cases, what's actually happening is that it's averaging things. So if you're talking about an AI engine for text generation, that generative model is actually averaging the likelihood that the next word or set of words or phrase that is written is the most likely to align to the inquiries. And so it puts together its sets of strings and things like that, all based on those averages. And unfortunately, in most cases, that information is drawn from the internet as a whole, or drawn from sort of Wild West land, where there hasn't been much screening done to determine the accuracy of the content that it's drawing in, or to determine the bias or the representation or lack thereof, or any of those things in the wild, right? And so, because most sources are coming from those spaces, then feeding natural language processing, even the written material that gets generated is going to have intrinsic bias, and it is going to have a failure to have broad representation. Now, the same thing is also true if you only use examples. If you say, oh, okay, well, I only want my AI to draw from my own internal materials. Well, then whatever internal patterns of bias and representation, underrepresentation exist in your own data are simply going to percolate up and then sort of pollute that. So bias and representation was before something that you had to sort of check for and clear, and it remains that way, right? Even under AI, you're still going to have to monitor for it. You're still going to have to look and see, what's going on here. Is this actually a critical thing? Um, in terms of attribution and originality, this is one that really plagues a lot of folks. And it was hard for me, I'll admit it. Obviously, I'm a doctor, like a PhD doctor. I studied long ago. We were taught in a very disciplined way to never draft off the work of another person. And uh, and AI is, we sort of anthropomorphize that and make that into a person in our mind, and that becomes a kind of a instant block. No, I can't. I would be stealing from the AI system. So how do we handle that? Well, it is often still, even years down the road, unclear who owns AI generated content. Now, most of the creators of natural language processing models and of generative AI models have specific legal contracts that say, this material that you generated is your property. And they have rules about what can be generated, can't be generated, and so on. They also often have a legacy of drawing material from the internet at large, from what are considered to be open data sets or open databases, but that weren't specifically licensed. And so those are all subject to legal challenges in the future. So one of the challenges you're going to find is that your security teams, your IT teams, your law teams, they're all going to come back at you and say, but the product that you're using is only authorized for this or this, or it's not authorized for this other kind of material. And those have to do with the input and the output. What you're drawing into your system through the materials coming in from the AI engine, and what you're putting into the AI engine based on legal exposure or risk that you might be adding for the corporation. So you have to have a very solid understanding of, what am I using? What kind of AI system am I using? Is it an open one? Does it learn from the materials that I've used? Does it digest those materials and remember them and then integrate them? Could I be exposing company secrets by having a simple chat with a chat agent? Could I be putting ourselves as a company in legal risk, and so on? So all of these things become really important. And I know that I haven't given you these sort of firm answers, and it's very frustrating, but I can explain to you that at the very least, in terms of attribution and originality, one of the recommendations that I'm going to make time and time again is be transparent. Expose if AI was used in the creation of some learning product that you have used, and have a specific review process and procedure in place as a process that says this was produced by AI and therefore it must be reviewed by humans. If it was run by AI or even contributions from AI, then it should be post processed by humans, so that you have someone who is accountable, an actual human who has read and processed all the information, looked at all the imagery, and who agrees that the net result is good. Now, usually that's also an editor, someone who will make changes, make modifications, because what was produced originally is not good enough. But that is going to almost universally be a recommendation. Require transparency and require involvement. Don't just push a button, go and walk back and pick up your finished product. Instead, make sure that there's active involvement between you and the content that's being produced in every case. That transparency obviously means that everyone should know that AI was involved in that process. And so there should be some sort of label or similar wouldn't be a bad idea to have some sort of branding that would also then encourage people to know that this is okay. Because one of the other problems you'll discover is people are reluctant or hesitant to use these solutions if they don't see other people using the solutions. And then finally, misinformation risk is a huge thing, and that hallucination can be a huge thing. So let me ask you a question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how prepared do you feel for your organization to start moving into this AI shift? 1 being not at all prepared, 5 being, yes, we're already there. We're mature. We're full on mature, or we want to be. How prepared do you feel? I'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and poke those numbers. I'll poke one myself here.
Yeah, we'll give everybody about 5 more seconds.
Cool.
And here are those results.
Awesome. How do we do? Oh, I am not surprised. So it looks like most of us feel sort of in the middle. A few people are sort of willing to admit they're totally unprepared. But it leans more toward the 2 and 3 on a whole, right? I'd say that that's 44 out of 60 in that 2 to 3 zone. So not a lot of firm commitment on either end of the spectrum. And I'd say we're still, as a group, we're kind of leaning toward, I'm not so sure I'm ready for all of this. I don't blame you. I felt ready 2 months ago, and then I learned more, and I felt much less ready. And then, based on learning more, I went out and learned more, and now I feel much less ready. And that pattern just seems to be continuing in a cycle. There is a lot to wrap our heads around here. It is not a simple matter, and it has tendrils and implications that are going out in all directions. The one thing I would say about this is I have found, and it's my case personally, but it also seems to be the case with everyone I find who's working in this area, there is tremendous appreciation in organizations for those of us who are marching out ahead and sort of willing to take the punches and explore these areas and then share what we learned. It's very helpful when other people share. I love to hear it, and I think that it helps for me to share so that I have a sense of what people are actually after. Cool. 71% of people in a 2024 Gartner report, 71% of compliance executives cited AI hallucinations as a top risk to their business. Top risk to their business. 3 out of 4, basically, were saying, hey, hallucinations are a serious risk for our business. And I think, at least in part, we're seeing sort of the state of the industry at that moment. This is from Q1 of 2024, getting to the middle end of 2024, even we started to see much more serious efforts to put some extreme rails around things like hallucinations, so that it became much more difficult to just sort of throw hallucinations into the mix. If you've worked with some of the more recent chat engines, some of the more research aligned ones, you can provide guidance that really shifts that number from 97% accuracy up to even 98, 99% accuracy. So there's definitely very rapid progress on that front. Will it ever reach 100% accuracy? Well, I mean, you could argue quite effectively that humans are not really 100% accurate either. So it's definitely into a space where it is freakishly accurate, but it can still be edited, and it still should be, and we should still be observing it in a very transparent way. One of the reasons is because we have a lot of vocabulary, a lot of ways of speech that have multiple meanings. And that's where it really falls flat often. And when that happens, you don't want that garbage in your materials that you produced, right? So one, it's going to become super obvious. And if you didn't do dutiful revelation of your transparency that you used AI, you'll look like a crazy person. But two, it will create a sort of nuisance, right? For everybody in the chain. Everything will have to be reviewed again. Somebody will get upset. There'll have to be a giant process internally where everybody says, how did this slip through the system? And you can see it, there's the pattern already, right? So how can you ensure that the content produced won't have legal baggage? This is a big problem. And here's why. Because if you just accept that AI engine that somebody is selling out there on the market and say, okay, well, it looks solid enough, but you don't review it for its legal exposure, then you may well end up purchasing something that your legal team on review says, I'm sorry, you may have bought it, but we're not using it. And the reason is because depending on what it is and depending how it was built, it may have leveraged, you don't know, 10,000 medical documents from the Journal of American Medicine. And those may all be licensed, but not licensed for that AI engine. And that would be very, very bad for you because then it's not just the company's problem, it's now your problem because you've created materials based on that, which were essentially illegally accessing these procedural documents from JAMA. Make sense? So you have to understand that there are legal risks and liabilities here. That information, excuse me, my goodness, that information should be identified by vendors of this kind of material in their documentation ahead of time. People often ask me why does it take a while for the big companies to come out with their new features? They show them to us, and then it takes a long time for them to go live. And the answer is really it's usually legal because there has to be legal clearance on all of the materials that go into that engine. And that legal clearance needs to be sufficient to overcome challenges in a corporate environment, which is much more stringent than just sort of, posting memes on the internet or something like that. So it's definitely a real concern. So let's drill in on this and look a little bit at the legal risks. Legal risks. They typically stem from copyright misrepresentation and compliance violations. So that you're representing a thing as something that it's not, that you're failing to comply with regulatory and legal requirements, or that there's a copyright on something that you've unwittingly leveraged through its back access to the content. Now, one of the reasons this is so fuzzy is because words are words, right? So if you're talking about natural language processing and using a natural language processing engine to sort of create these paragraph sentences and so on, in most cases, you're not going to end up with the kind of plagiarism that a young student would write, right? Because it's not coming from those materials verbatim. So there would have to be an awareness on the part of the copyright holder that their material had been illegally used as part of the engine. And the reason this gets so muddy, and now that's just words, the graphics and images is the same problem, but in a different, broader sense. That violation comes when that material is integrated into the library without appropriate permissions and license. But there are arguments about it because the way that all of these systems work is through abstracting and averaging. And it's so abstracted and so deeply averaged that there's no longer a pure relationship between the originating content and the output content. Not the way that we think of relationships, right? Like if we think of, oh, that time that Joe cheated in college and got in big trouble because they like lifted 5 paragraphs from this book. Not at all like that. Not even like the time that Julie cheated in college and got in trouble because she used the same phrase. And you learned, holy cow, I can't even borrow a phrase without quoting it. No, this is like the fundamental nature of the idea or the thought can be carried across. And it can be an aggregate from multiple kinds of sources. But if you didn't have legal right to the sources from which that idea came, and then AI presented you with that idea, and you were like, yeah, that's the idea. You could have validated it and said, yeah, that's absolutely right. You could have had sources for it and said, yeah, that seems absolutely the right source. You could have done everything right, but because there were legal baggage issues with the original source documents, you're now in trouble and you really shouldn't be. And so that kind of thing leads to all the kind of controversy that you hear around these things. And it also leads to a new need for you, which is when you're having your IT and your legal teams and your compliance teams, all of these folks vet the software that's coming in, it's going to take them longer. And they're going to need to ensure that they're given waiver of liability for the content copyrights, for the materials that were used to create the actual um, uh, AI. Okay. And that's all going to exist in the technical documentation of the AI from the vendor. And so you absolutely are going to want to have um, allowed extra time and bandwidth. I'm hearing from people. I had a great meeting the other day with representatives from IBM and from a large math and engineering company, and they were talking about how it has meant that when they want to adopt an AI solution, it has to be sort of enterprise wide because the personnel that they need to go through all of these contracts and ensure that everything is well in hand and that all of the legal conditions are met is really huge, and it puts a huge demand on the system. And so if at the same time we have thousands of applications that are sort of everyday applications but for very narrow audiences, those become much harder for them to get through, and yet the risk is still high, so they don't want to take that risk and put the company in a bad strait. So that's why all this crazy. Hopefully that helps a little bit to explain it. So copyright infringement, the hot issue. Regulatory oversight. So if this is a regulated industry, the content has to be vetted against the current most up-to-date rules and protocols. Most of it isn't. Your blanket ChatGPT out of the box doesn't have even access to web content that's newer than, I think, a year or 2 years old. You can get more modern ones that have updated, or you can get some that'll actually do the searching live based on what your interest is in order to get the most recent content. But again, then you're back to those issues of, well, how do I know that that material was vetted? So, and then defamation and libel. If the AI creates people, personas, case studies, or statements that mirror real people, even accidentally, that increases your risk. So it begins to become, again, a matter for experts to sort out. Best practice here: use enterprise grade AI platforms that have clear IP indemnification policies. That's what you're going to want to make sure you use, and that's what you should pass on to your IT admins and your legal teams if you want to ensure that you're in the least risk profile. So just a brief note about Adobe and how Adobe handles this, just because Adobe is an example of a vendor here that does this kind of thing, and I obviously work with Adobe. So here you can see that we are guided by Adobe's AI ethics principles of accountability, responsibility, and transparency. So that's fundamentally in the nature of what we do. You see that in things like Firefly, where it automatically generates information that you can associate to show that an image has been generated by Firefly, that can be embedded automatically in the meta, that can be tracked through with other tools like Photoshop and so on. Ethical AI development means making sure that the training models are only working on permissible data. In Adobe's case for images, it means paying people to contract their images before those images get included into an AI data set. Rigorous testing and impact assessment of all the AI-powered features to make sure that hallucinations are removed. So I think of that as enterprise level or enterprise ready, where you've clearly identified that hallucinations are not going to be a factor here. Usually the way that that's being done is by adding databases which are specific to that individual customer and their specific use case. And then finally, stringent security practices for application data and cloud infrastructure. That's about that input, output, what goes in, what comes out, and how can that be sealed away from the world at large, from the AI engine at large, and so on, so that the material that is about your company is not at risk of being somehow exposed through your contribution. Because one thing a lot of people don't realize is, especially with text-based engines, when you share information with that engine, if it's a learning engine, it could well be taking the data that you gave it and using it to learn about the world. And that data, if it was proprietary, you just accidentally expose that data outside your company to the world at large. Um, I wanted to mention the AI maturity here in this context, just because I'm about to ask you a question about how you feel about AI maturity in your organization. And I like this model. This model is from Justin Seeley. You see how in the bottom you have sort of awareness and then experimentation and then adoption, enablement, innovation. I'm curious, and you can just type your answers in the chat. I'm curious to know, what do you guys think is your current level on this ladder? Do you have a sense of where you feel like you are on the ladder? Do you not have a sense? Where would you put your organization on the AI maturity ladder? I'll open my chat window so I can see. I'll also check to see what kind of things you guys have been saying. Some experimentations, somewhere between adoption and enablement. Lots of experimentation, a little bit of adoption. Stacy's team is piloting, some enablement. Cool. I'm not surprised. Yeah. I think it's good to sort of see that maturity model. And I'll put it back there for you in case you guys want to. I think we also have, are we sharing? Are we sharing?
Yes.
We are. So I sent the PDF deck so you guys can have the deck as well. And the deck has a text track. For those of you who hate when the speaker goes off text track, I apologize. But for those of you who like it because then you get to hear a whole other viewpoint, then you'll probably enjoy, because I wrote the text out, but I don't follow it. Uh, Next up, 68% of CMOs, chief marketing officers, surveyed by Adobe, said they were concerned about the legal exposure of AI created marketing materials. This from a 2024 study, Marketing Executives and AI Readiness Survey. 68% worried about legal exposure of AI created marketing materials. So even though they know that AI generated material could be superior, could be fast, could be that sort of thing, they didn't necessarily trust it because they're worried about legal exposure. This one's a great example. This one created by Adobe Firefly. The other images of people in here were created by Adobe Firefly. And each of those cases, I can spot a few things, right? Like I'm right away, like the perfection of the people has me suspect right away. Some of the abstractions around clothing have me suspect. Some of the style choices and so on. But it's gotten pretty tight. Like I probably would fail a test maybe 30% of the time to know whether an image had been generated by an AI tool. And that's across a wide range of tools. It was at one point there was only one or two tools that could fool me. Now half the tools, maybe 70% of the tools on the market can fool me. And I have a pretty sharp eye. So what we're dealing with here is a very legitimate concern, and that could cause a significant slowdown in the dissemination of AI-based content, because part of the problem is marketing teams and people end up spending a huge amount of time, money, and effort getting the slick, right? In other words, not long ago, probably a year ago, I would design my deck materials and then send them out to a design firm that would send them back with custom images, usually something coming from Adobe Stock and so on. So now easily placing in some kind of Firefly images, that takes a lot less time. It also takes a lot less iteration. It means that I can spend more time building more presentations and doing that sort of thing. But those CMOs were rightly concerned about the legal exposure, right? What if a woman who looks just like this comes back and says, but that's me, right? And you'd think that wouldn't happen, but I've seen it. I work with Adobe. We work on tool sets. I've seen cases where there was a model waiver on the photograph of the person. It was still contested, right? So these are real situations for real companies that really happen, and that you have to be aware that there might include legal exposure, if in fact a judge finds that you were wrong, that you were somehow in breach. So these are definitely real concerns. They have not been tested as much as I would have expected them to be tested, and so it's interesting to see that there haven't been any like super strong tests yet. Um, and I'm sure that we will. We will in time see some kind of interesting, varied super tests. We'll just have to see what those start to look like and how they behave. I also heard something in the news the other day that one of the big tech bros out there was trying to say that there shouldn't be any more copyright, that we should completely abandon copyright and the like, which sounds like something that I don't think people would get too excited about. Certainly, artists and others who hold copyright, at least for some limited period of time, and not to mention large corporations who've been trying to wean 100 years out of copyright. Those issues are real, right? And they're going to more and more come to the fore. So how can you ensure that you do not unwittingly expose your private or your secure data? I've been sort of talking about this throughout: input risks, output risks, trying to keep an eye on the clock. Your input risks are like feeding your proprietary data into the public models, and the output risks are AI could surface sensitive patterns or internal references if it's not isolated from operational data. So you want to make sure that your operational data is never put in there. I think there's a good suggestion in the best practice here: never paste confidential information into consumer grade chatbots. Implement role-based access control and data anonymization protocols, and use private or on-premise AI environments for sensitive data. And those are all things you can do. And so knowing the difference between data which exposes PII, knowing the difference between data which exposes your corporate practices or policies or other things that might create security risks, and isolating those from the practice that you have commonly. This all just translates to education, right? And that translates to educating your teams so they know what's coming, what to expect. So a few interesting emerging roles that are coming about as people start to look into this space. Prompt engineers, incredibly important. Um, you know, I can't I cannot overstate how critical it is to start to look at how we are educating people to become prompt engineers and how seriously we are taking people who are gifted in this field. It requires a very logical mind, it requires an extensive vocabulary, it requires an ability to perceive how the AI model is working itself and then to manipulate that with your input prompts. It's incredible. And especially in learning and development, it requires a deep understanding of learning theory, of different approaches to learning. There's so much to know and so much specialization required. Prompt engineers, absolutely essential. Look for that to be one of the most common professions going forward, and one that is just desperately important. AI ethicists, folks who can help us with all this information, AI trainers, people can help us get the educational materials together. And notice how much of this falls on learning and development teams. And then finally, critical thinking, AI literacy, and ethical decision making. These are absolutely skills which have come to be incredibly important because there's so much fuzz in the mix. I loved this quote from Brad Smith, Microsoft president, who said the current moment calls for guardrails, not brakes, urging companies to move forward with deliberate constraints. In other words, policies, procedures, having thought seriously about exactly how they're doing the implementations. But don't slam on the brakes, don't stop things, don't roadblock things. I think that's so important. I often think of corporate world as enablers and gatekeepers. I think we need to have a very clear differentiation between gatekeepers and guardrails, right? Guardrails are policies which facilitate and enable. Gates are objects which prevent or ban. And we're not going to make any progress if all we do is throw up gates. We have to look at it as guardrails to guide people toward the eventual goal. Just a quick note, what's the difference between generative AI and other use cases? This is a nice chart if you want to snapshot it, or as I said, you can download the PDF. Notice here the differentiation between generative AI, predictive AI, classifying AI, and conversational AI. If you've only been thinking, oh, I can create text and I can create images, you're behind the curve already, because you can do so much more. Notice those examples: course scripts, graphics, simulations, skill gap analysis, churn risk, learner segmentation and tagging, AI coaches and support bots. I would predict that by next year, this list will be twice as long. And after that, even longer. It's just going to keep growing and growing and growing. I'm going to skip that one for now because I know I'm running out of time.
Yes, I was about to say we're actually at time, my friend.
Oh, Liz. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, if you want to put in the chat what your biggest challenge is, that would be fantastic. I will let you know that in the PDF download, I also included a summary of this whole presentation in just 1, 2, 3, 4 little blips. And I've got links to the article, which goes hand in hand with Who's Driving This Bus, and one that goes hand in hand with Navigating Deep Waters of Modern Corporate Training in AI.
Beautiful. Well,
Thanks,
with
Liz.
that, yeah, of course. Is there anything else you would like to leave with the audience today before we head them to the next session?
No, thanks so much for coming. I'm sorry I didn't get to Q&A. I kind of worried that I wouldn't. I warned Liz that it would probably go over. But if you want to reach out to me at all, I'm Dr. Partridge on LinkedIn. If you happen to scan that QR code, that's where it will take you. I encourage you to ping me there.
Yes. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alan. You are amazing. This was a great session. And for everyone asking about links, you will get his PDF in the follow-up email that will be sent today, 5 p.m. Eastern time. So definitely check your inbox for those links. But thank you so much, Alan.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes. And for everyone else, if you're new or you came in the first session, we will be taking about a 13 to 12-minute break. And up next, we have Shweta and Rajesh from ComLab India for their session, The AI Advantage, Re-engage and Disengage Learners at Scale and Speed. So in just a moment, I'm going to end this session, and you can join our next session by returning to the event lobby and going to the session tab. I hope you all stick around for our next session, which will begin at the top of the hour. See you soon, everybody.